Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another book talk hosted by the Stone Center for Research on Wealth, Inequality, and Mobility. I'm Geoff Wodtke, an associate director at the Stone Center, and I'm excited to introduce tonight's event, where we'll have a chance to discuss the effects of immigration and immigration policy on economic well-being in the U.S. A conversation that's going to be centered on Tara Watson's book, The Border Within, The Economics of Immigration in an Age of Fear. Our featured guest tonight, Tara, is an economist whose research focuses on American social policy and its connections with immigration, family demography, and population health. She's currently director of the Center for Economic Security and Opportunity at the Brookings Institution. Her book brings a data-driven cost-benefit analysis to the public debate on immigration. And this is an issue that was clearly central in our latest election cycle, and that will almost certainly continue to provoke animated discussions, probably disagreements in the coming years. Joining Tara for our discussion this evening are several of my esteemed colleagues. Damon Jones, who is my fellow associate director at the Stone Center and also a professor here at Harris, and Rene Flores, an associate professor here in the Department of Sociology. He studies migration, race and ethnicity, and social inequality. And so each, brings a distinctive perspective and a wealth of expertise to the topic at hand. So following the discussion among our panelists, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. But now, please just join me in extending a warm welcome to our speakers for what I'm certain will be a thought-provoking conversation. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk about a book that I wrote several years ago called The Border Within, and also to give a little bit of an update of what's happened since the book was released. There's been some discussion of immigration, you might have heard. I'm going to try to cram a lot of information into 15 minutes. It's a big topic to cover in that amount of time. So think of this maybe as a kind of teaser or a trailer, and I hope that this will just be the beginning of a conversation that we'll have here, and then happy to talk with people after in the reception or tomorrow or whenever. Just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about some basic facts. The U.S. is a country with many immigrants in it. About 14% of our population is born outside the U.S., and I'm going to use the term foreign-born and immigrant interchangeably. If we think back historically, the fraction of the population that was born outside the U.S. is roughly the same now as it was around 1900, which is often referred to as the golden age of migration. So we're at a high level, but not an unprecedented level. If you focus on the last 5 years here, or 6 years that are shown in orange, I've highlighted them in orange in part to make it clear that the graph is going decade by decade until that part, but also to show you that things had kind of flattened out between 2018, 2020. There wasn't much growth in migration. Of course, some of that was due to the pandemic, but even before that, starting as early as 2016, we saw some declines in immigrant inflows. And then since the pandemic recovery, there has been really quite a large surge in immigration, which is it's been debated about how big that's been, and I'll talk about that briefly. The book was released in 2021. It was written with a journalist, Kalee Thompson. And what we tried to do in the book is to take the large academic literature, particularly the economics literature, focused on immigration and its impacts on the economy. We were narrowing in specifically on the role of enforcement, immigration enforcement, and within that, specifically on enforcement in the interior, as opposed to what was happening at the border. We then interviewed a number of families to try to see how what we had learned about from the academic literature matched what they told us was their perspective on what was happening. And we try to weave those things together in the book. There were a few key themes that emerged from this exercise. One is that overall, immigration is good for the US economy. There is a very large econ literature on this. What we find is that in general, there are small impacts on wages and employment of US-born people when more immigrants arrive. There are some potentially positive impacts for people, especially those with more education, potentially some small negative impacts for those with less education, but overall the story is largely a positive one. We see that immigrants are really an important contributor to our labor force growth. We have a situation right now where fertility is declining, our growth in our working age population has been somewhat stagnant, and immigrants are filling that gap. We, of course, have some industries that are very dependent on immigrant labor. There's also a whole talk I could give about the role of immigrants in innovation, in STEM, in entrepreneurship, in small business, Main Street business that people talk about. Very important there. And then there's a large literature on the fiscal impacts, which again are generally found to be positive, especially at the federal level. At the state and local level, on average, immigration tends to be negative in the short run and neutral in the long run. Just to hammer home the point about the demography, so thinking big picture about our economy and its growth, we, like many other countries, have gone from a pyramid-shaped demography to one that is more like a pillar. And what we see is that immigrants, who are shown here in the darker pink and darker blue shades, are filling in the gaps for the working age population, this part in the middle of the graph here, that is helping us to support our old age programs. And the children of immigrants are the next generation that are coming up. So the result of that is that immigration is actually the main source of population growth. That's been true for the past few years, but it is also projected to be true going forward. And in fact, the US population pretty soon will be in decline, if not for the fact that we do have healthy immigration. Another theme from the book is that there's no neat separation between immigrants and the US-born population. So if we're thinking about policies that affect immigrants, they also affect the broader community. For example, many children have an immigrant parent, about a quarter. About 7% of children who are citizens have an undocumented parent. And so when we think about enforcement, especially interior enforcement, that is enforcement for people who are living here and part of the community, that's going to affect families, US citizen children, social networks, schools, you name it. It's not something that's isolated to a specific population. Another key point that comes out in the book is that if you do a cost-benefit analysis, and I say this kind of loosely, I didn't literally come up with costs and benefits in dollar terms, but really, if you think about the evidence of what interior enforcement does in terms of its humanitarian costs, its explicit fiscal costs, and its economic impacts, it's hard to make the case that this makes a lot of sense. We spend a lot through Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, as well as some other arms of enforcement. There's a lot of humanitarian burden, especially on immigrant families, but as I just mentioned, that goes beyond just those families. And the important thing that I hope people take away from the book is that the enforcement does not just impact people who are directly impacted, but it really does change the lived experience of a broader set of people because of the fear and uncertainty that comes with it. And so we see these quote unquote chilling effects, which is the idea that it's not the enforcement itself, but the fear of the enforcement in a lot of different areas of life, including whether people choose to go get health care, whether they send their kids to school. We see declines in cooperation with police for crime fighting. A lot of areas where we believe that the chilling effects might actually be even bigger than the direct effects of, say, a deportation. And there really isn't much evidence on the question, but I would say it's hard to make a case that interior enforcement in particular has a deterrent effect for future migration. So we walked out of the book project with those themes in mind. Since then, we've really seen a pretty big surge in migration and actually very little interior enforcement in relative terms under the Biden administration than was true either in the previous Trump administration or in the Obama administration. There are about 11 or 12 million, what you might think of as long-term undocumented residents in the US, and then there have been several million more people who have arrived in the past couple of years, shown with this dark line here. This is a graph based on Congressional Budget Office data. This other non-immigrant category contains a lot of different groups of people, but most of this group has been people who have come to the border, have been allowed into the country to pursue an asylum claim or on some sort of humanitarian parole program, but they don't have any permanent legal status in the US or even really a temporary firm status in the US. So that group is actually potentially quite at risk if administrative priorities change. About half of people who seek asylum and get into the sort of process for asylum eventually have that denied. And so that's going to be a large group of people who will be facing potential risk of removal or deportation once they have that decision made. There, of course, has been a lot of talk about the border, and when I was writing the book, I kept saying, everyone's focused on the border, people shouldn't focus on the border, but now I'm a person who's been focused on the border for the past couple of years, and in part that's because there has been a lot of activity at the border. What you see, the high point of these bars are the number of people presenting at the border who are considered inadmissible, meaning they don't have a visa. What's shown in the black line is the people who have actually come through the border. So that's a fraction of the people who actually show up at the border. And again, it was a large group, especially in 2023. And we have really no policy plan for them. So of course, the Trump campaign made mass deportation a campaign promise. It's hard to know exactly what that means in terms of numbers of people or how aggressive it will be. Vance has thrown out a number like 1 million. Trump has thrown out a variety of numbers up to 20 million. As you can see from these numbers, there aren't even really 20 million deportable people probably in the US. So I don't expect it to be quite at that extreme. But I do think we will see considerably more interior enforcement than we saw in the first Trump term. To give you a little sense of what happened in the first Trump term, there were about 80,000 people removed per year from the interior of the country. The Biden administration did much less than that, but Obama had actually done quite a bit more than that. So thinking about what it would be like to scale up what Trump did in the first term by maybe 10, probably not 200 times, it would be pretty dramatic. The group that I view as most at risk would be that group that I mentioned that is here on a temporary program, parole program, or seeking asylum. There will be some backlash. I think the biggest initial barrier will be some logistical hurdles it's expensive to remove people. There's a legal process. I don't think it's quite as easy as the administration might think it is. And we'll probably see more enforcement in places like work sites, but also sensitive locations. So these are things like hospitals that have traditionally been more or less off limits. It's likely we'll see more local law enforcement and military potentially involvement in this. And I think even if it's not mass deportation of the type that Trump has described in terms of the numbers, what we will see is an increase that likely will be pretty visible and disruptive. There's a broader set of immigration policies. So deportation has gotten a lot of attention for good reasons, but immigration inflows did slow down during the first Trump administration. I expect that will happen again to some degree. That's both because of removals, people leaving voluntarily, but also the legal migration system will have more sand in the gears, and probably there will be tighter border patrol. But if you remember that graph I showed you before, the border activity has actually significantly slowed already. Before the election, some colleagues and I did a projection of what would likely happen in terms of immigration inflows. We thought that in the bottom line there, which we call Trump low, which is not the most extreme, crazy scenario you could think of, but just sort of maybe an 80th percentile of likely Trump policy options, you would probably see a decline in or net negative immigration inflows, which would be very unusual historically. That would then would be more extreme at the beginning of the administration, we projected, and then would gradually return to normal. But the difference between that and some of the other scenarios was up to about 10 million people being in the US and available to work potentially by 2034. So that has macroeconomic implications. Legal migration is something that has been basically stuck in Congress for decades. The caps on legal migration, different categories, were mostly set in 1990. Our economy has roughly doubled in size since 1990, so they really don't make a lot of sense. But it's been really hard to get Congress to move forward on this. I don't think the chances of that are very good in the coming couple of years. There's a graphic here from the Cato Institute, which is a think tank in Washington that's sort of a libertarian think tank. They tend to be pro-immigration, and they have calculated that less than 1% of the people in the world who might want to move to the US actually could do so legally, and this is a graphic illustrating just how complicated the legal migration system is. So my view is that this is actually really belongs in Congress's court. The decision-making that is, because Congress has been so quiet about this, really all the decision-making ends up in the executive branch. I think that's just bad for policy-making. It means we flip-flop every time there's a change in the administration. And I think it's bad for the economy. One economist has called this leaving trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the comments. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here today, and thank you to the Center, the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility for their kind invitation for me to be here. And I see a lot of some of my students, I see them here. We'll be talking about this in class tomorrow, so thanks for make sure you're taking notes. I deeply enjoyed reading this book written by Tara Watson and Kalee Thompson. I actually have a lot of notes here that I took over my reading. It's a very comprehensive book. It really covers most of the debates about immigration that we scholars spent a lot of time thinking about. Where do immigrants come from? What is their effect on the economy and the job prospects of natives? Do immigrants depend on social services? What is the relationship between immigration and crime, which was a central theme of the presidential campaign that just ended? Are immigrants a burden or are they a benefit to public coffers? What is the effect of border and interior enforcement on immigrants and their families? Each one of these questions is at sea in studies. I mean, we can spend most of our career just focusing on one question. I work on immigrant adaptation and public attitudes towards immigration. And I just Googled that, and there's 12,000 articles just on that particular question. So this is actually pretty impressive, the breadth. It's also a very nuanced book. It's very clearly written and very accessible. And I think there's something to be said about collaborating with journalists. I want to find my own journalist, so I can write as clearly as this book is written. I'm pretty sure that's the trick, right? And I really also appreciated how they use both quantitative data, but also they follow 6 immigrants from Latin America and Asia, and they show how they navigate this very dysfunctional immigration system that we have in place. So that's very compelling evidence that makes the book even more vivid. And I'm curious to hear more about your day-to-day experiences working with a journalist and whether or not that shaped the kind of work that you do. But I have 3 main questions for Tara. The first question is that you describe a highly dysfunctional immigration system in which the costs far outweigh the benefits. Each year, the U.S. spends billions of dollars on detention and deportation without a clear economic gain, and at the same time at a great human cost. You argue that aggressive enforcement does little to reduce the undocumented population, and it doesn't really seem to deter future migration. At the same time, it does create a climate of fear, what you call chilling effects, that affects many children of immigrants, and many of them, as we know, they're US-born citizens, right? So this is affecting legal residents of the US. And I think your book very clearly shows how the system is dysfunctional, but I'm also wondering, why is it dysfunctional? Like, what's the reason why we have such a dysfunctional immigration system? And in the conclusions, you argue that this system is driven by a mostly Republican base who views immigrants as a threat to their vision of a traditional American identity, which is defined as white and as speaking English without an accent, right? That's the argument. But so these policies of harassing, of detaining, of deporting immigrants appeal to these white nationalist voters, but without affecting or reducing the immigrant labor, the labor force, because that would alienate Republican business leaders, right? So it's a way to try to have your cake and eat it in a certain sense. However, my question is white nationalism the main driver of these aggressive enforcement policies? After all, Donald Trump just got reelected last week running on a very harsh anti-immigrant platform, promising mass deportation of immigrants. That was one of the key campaign promises, yet increasing numbers of Latino, Asian, and African-American men voted for Trump, more so than last time around. Actually, the Austin American Statesman, a newspaper, they did run a story a couple of days ago where they interviewed Latino day laborers in Texas. Many of them are undocumented. And they found that many of them supported Trump. And many of them hoped that he would bring order to the border. So how can we make this sense? Should we think of white nationalism as the key driver for these aggressive enforcement policies, or are there larger social political trends that cut across race, ethnicity, class, and gender that may be driving support for this system that we have currently in place? So that's my first question. Second question is about the purpose of the book. Like, what is the goal of the book? We typically think of trade books as hoping to influence public policy, as hoping to inject neutral and solid evidence to a debate about policies. But the thing is, one of the traits about the immigration debate is that it's typically data-free. It typically doesn't run on objective facts. Political entrepreneurs, and we're actually reading about this week in class. Political entrepreneurs deploy metaphors and symbols. They that often are unrelated to objective reality. They seek to stir up emotions and feelings among voters instead of having a rational debate about the costs and benefits of border enforcement. You have policymakers accusing Haitian immigrants of eating pets. So they really are trying to bypass this rational thinking, and they're really trying to use the symbols that oftentimes prove quite effective in mobilizing public sentiment and defining immigrants. So as a Democratic pollster put it recently on Twitter, which I guess is now called X, the immigration debate runs on vibes and not on facts. So that's a challenge, right? And you see that many people are actually semi-impervious to statistics. I know this from doing field work in the mid-2000s, and I'm dating myself here now. But there were a number of communities in Pennsylvania and across the country that passed harsh anti-immigrant policies, including the community of Hazleton. So I went to some of those communities to try to understand why is it that some of the locals passed these policies against immigrants. And I remember, and these were areas that used to vote for the Democratic Party for a long time. These were union townships. And I remember interviewing this woman, middle-aged woman, who supported the anti-immigrant policy. She told me she was very concerned about crime, because the thinking was that immigrants were bringing crime. And I said, you know what, I'm glad you brought up crime, because I have some statistics from the FBI on the crime in your community, and I'm pulling out the files. And then she said, I don't believe in numbers. I don't believe in statistics. I believe in how I feel, and I don't feel safe. So that's the tricky thing about immigration, right? That is based on these subjective feelings. So I wonder, how do you see your book playing, in this largely, what role do you think it should be playing in this largely subjective process? What audience do you have in mind for it? And more generally, I know there's a lot of public policy scholars in the room or students of that, but what do you think should be the role of immigration scholars that would like to actually influence public policy making, given the subjective realm in which immigration typically is discussed? Okay, and my last question is about the future. So I'm going to ask you about the second Trump administration. His allies, Trump allies, and himself, they've mentioned a number of policies that they would like to implement, and that includes ending DACA. That includes ending birthright citizenship. That includes also re-implementing family separation at the border, more worksite raids. But really, their focus has been on mass deportations, right? That's been one of the campaign promises, as Tara mentioned. So we know that these policies would be highly disruptive for immigrants and their families. And as we know, many of their family members are actually documented. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on the likely effect of these policies, for example, of mass deportation on natives. I feel like that typically is not discussed as much. Could this mass deportation of immigrants create a shortfall of workers that could affect the overall economy by limiting the supply of goods and services? For example, there's evidence that secure communities under the Obama administration, we know that through this program, more than 400,000 immigrants were expelled. And there's evidence that this resulted in lower wages and employment for native-born workers, right? Partly because some businesses depend on immigrant labor, and they could not operate without immigrants. So this created essentially a negative effect for a lot of natives. And when we think about the scale of those deportation campaigns, like Tara mentioned, they have a pretty, they're talking about different numbers. It could be in the millions of folks that could be potentially affected. And this could have spillover consequences for a lot of native workers that are typically not discussed in everyday policy debates. So thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Welcome to our event, and my remarks are going to be more brief because I don't want to stand in the way of the interesting discussion that's starting to be queued up. So I'll just say a couple brief remarks. So I enjoyed reading the text, and I'm someone who's my research is not in this area, so I actually was able to learn a lot and get a crash course in some of the details, the ins and outs of our immigration policy. I appreciated the focus on interior enforcement from the book, where a lot of the discourse and public discourse will focus on the border. I appreciated that. And as Rene said, I also appreciated the mix of quantitative data, research from the economics literature, but also there are these stories of these families that I would say more than just navigate this process, like they're being thrown around by this process. Kind of their lives are being disrupted, and you see some very you get a I don't know, an up close and intimate look at the effects on families, the human cost, the human toll of these policies. So, actually, some of the things I wanted to say, Rene already covered. So I'll focus on one thing that I kept coming back to in reading through the book, which was that a focus of the book is that this book is about like law enforcement in the United States, a particular type of law enforcement enforcing these immigration laws, and some of the features of this type of law enforcement, include detainment and incarceration. There's discussion of a kind of, the term I would use would be terror. I mean, the chilling effect is, a way of using high-profile interventions or raids and things like that to have to amplify the effect of these policies by putting people into places of fear, which is how terror works. You do something, and then you don't have to do as much costly enforcement. You have sent a message that will restrict what people do and where they go. There's a discussion about the effectiveness of some of the interior enforcement policies or the lack thereof. And so that raises a question of why do we do these things if they're not as big of a deterrent as they're purported to be? And so, then you think about, the desire to punish people through these policies, and who has a demand for that type of punishment. We'd like to see that our elected officials are doing something to punish the bad guys. And so part of the policies are just to make life, to make life very miserable, to try to deter people from doing things. But people are here, their families are here, their children are here, and so they're just kind of stuck in place bearing these burdens, like continual tax. Another, aspect of this is that, and this is what Rene also touched on, which is there are certain interest group that this type of enforcement appeals to. So it's politically beneficial to be seen as someone who's tough on immigration. And that seems to be a bipartisan phenomenon, if you look at that picture, in the sense that it seems to have there's activity across different administrations and different parties. And also there's a feature of, the desire to kind of segregate, which is very common at an international level, but this is to keep people outside of a community that we will not like them to try to join or become a part of. And to me, it seems like part of what this type of enforcement does is it protects us from having to deal with certain broader social problems. There's violence in other countries. If we enforce our laws at our border, we don't have to, face the consequences of those issues. And that would make our citizens feel better to not have to grapple with those things. And so that with that resonated with me because it reminded me of law enforcement in the United States more generally. And so a lot of these features have been historically and are currently, this is not a perfect analogy, but they are components of some of the types of law enforcement we have. Some of the law enforcement we have creates these a condition of constant uncertainty and terror for people. When am I going to be pulled over? Or when am I, what's going to happen when I get pulled over? Will my children be taken away from me? There's a lot of, so law enforcement does a lot of different things, but one of the things is to let people know where they should go or where they're allowed to go. Not in this neighborhood. If you come here, there will be consequences. And so it reminded me of that feature of more generally of law enforcement. Bipartisan support. It is a very popular political stance to have to be able to be someone who's, tough on crime. And also how some of our law enforcement policies are designed to just remove the visibility of social problems from our sight. So if poverty or other things might lead to social problems, please just keep that away from, my neighborhood. And so I see that as a part of how law enforcement more generally is carried out in the United States. So I saw connections there. Like the assessment in the book is that the kind of punitive policies that we have in the interior enforcement of immigration policy, they're purported to do certain things that it's unclear that they're achieving those, and then they have pretty high human costs. And so I saw parallels with that. And, for example, when thinking about a lot of recent developments in how we treat homeless people, and, this is also a parallel that I saw in the sense that we can use law enforcement to try to solve homelessness by kind of just making it less visible. And so that was one thing that came to mind to me in terms of this critique of the immigration policies that we have. They have parallels in other types of law enforcement that we have. So what I want to do now is switch courses. We're going to have a moderated discussion. I'm the moderator. So Rene, you raised some questions, and some of those were some of the questions that I have. So we will weave those into some of the questions that I'm gonna share or ask you guys. So can you guys hear me? All right. That was my one instruction. I had to press that button. So I'm gonna just throw some questions out, and I'll target them or not, and and then we're gonna open it up to discussion. So, I actually had a question, and you can answer this as short and sweet, or as long as you want. Just had to step back a very, very big picture question, which is, what is immigration? What is that to you? What does it mean to you? How do you think about immigration? What does it evoke?
Thank you. That's a tough question, actually. But also, I want to thank both of you for your very thoughtful comments. Those are really helpful. I think of it in probably a pretty restrictive policy sense of people coming from outside the country and moving into the country. I think there's probably a broader way one could conceptualize it. The focus here, since it was really on U.S. policy, we weren't trying to get into those big philosophical questions about,
Sure.
What is a border? Yeah, we took the border as existing.
Fine. That's fine. And one reason I raise that question is because it kind of has this dual place in like U.S. identity. It's
Yes.
like both historically touted and presently, damned. And it's interesting that like it's something that is in the fabric of this country, and also, something that you can use, as your book says, to sort of engender fear.
Yeah, actually, there's a little bit in the book, but also a much broader econ literature by other people. That tension has really always been present in the U.S. This is not the first time that immigration has come up as a really contentious issue, even though we sort of may look back differently on migration from 100 years ago as we think about it today, but they were having the same conversation 100 years ago.
Right. And the book does take you off on a long arc too, so going back to the 19th century and some of those initial first laws, some of those initial immigration laws. I'm going to touch on actually what Rene raised at a policy school, where we are, our brand is evidence. And so in light of like policy discussions lately, there's been a questioning of, especially in looking at this election, like what is the role of evidence in these kind of political battles? Has it helped? Have those facts benefited the people who relied on them to try to win elections? And so just to reiterate Renee's question for you guys to discuss, doing research, presenting data, having evidence in the face of people who have these fears, who do you target that information to? For whom is that work? For whom does that not the best or the effective strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it can be demoralizing to listen to some of the rhetoric and feel like it's completely divorced from reality. So you mentioned the crime example. There's a huge economics literature. It's probably one of the areas of economics that has the most consensus about the relationship between immigrants and crime. And you hear sort of the public narrative being very far from that. That being said, what academics do or scholars do is to bring evidence and facts. And so I basically choose it as an article of faith that it's useful to continue to do this. And I don't think that my book or any book that is sort of in this vein would convince someone who comes to it with a very firm preconceived notion that they're unwilling to have an open mind on either side of a policy debate. But there is some group of people who actually wants to understand things better and who does care about the evidence. And I think it's important to be able to communicate what we know to those people. I think a lot of times the scholarly literature is something that everyone in the narrow subfield takes as obvious. Everyone knows it, but then you talk to someone at Thanksgiving dinner, and it's like you're having a completely different conversation. And I think one of the goals of this book was to try to take some of that knowledge that's sort of taken for granted in the academic or scholarly sphere and bring it to a somewhat more accessible voice so that it could reach a broader audience.
And I didn't mean to be overly pessimistic, right? I mean, but I have to be the devil's advocate, right? I mean, but I feel like there's evidence, growing evidence that, well, first of all, what we know is that most people are highly disinformed about the immigration system. Most people don't have a good idea of the composition of the immigrant population. They think that that most immigrants are undocumented. They think that a lot of immigrants are taking services, are committing crimes. So there's really a disconnection between perceptions of the immigrant community and their effects and their reality. And there's some incipient experimental evidence that presenting actual data may actually make individuals more sympathetic to immigrants. Like there's some evidence, for example, that when you show people, okay, this is the composition of the immigrant population, this is where they come from, this is the percentage of them that are undocumented, people feel like, oh, okay, so it's not really matching my priors, and there's some effect there. It's not a huge effect, but it's there. There's also some really interesting evidence from my good friend Alex Kustav in political science, that where essentially they're on this experiment where they show to individuals how complex the immigration system is. How, all the what you show in your book, like all this labyrinth of bureaucratic procedures that you have to navigate in order to apply for this visa or the other, and how it's actually very, very hard. When people are shown that, they become a little bit more pro-immigrant. So there's some evidence here that maybe at the margins it is consequential. We really hope so. The question is how durable these effects are, right? And whether or not they can actually move the needle at a national level. But yeah, there is some evidence.
So to follow up on that, on two potential groups, and one I'll ask you, Tara, and then I'll ask you, Rene, about the other group. One group, Tara, is like the people that you are interviewing who were immigrating to the United States, being deported, having their families disrupted. Did you talk with them about the research or your research, or was that empowering or welcomed or obvious, or did that ever come up?
Only in very broad strokes, I would say. I did not dig into the level of detail that's presented in the book, mainly because we wanted to focus on hearing their narrative without
Leading it. Yeah.
sort of leading it in a particular direction. As I was saying in the green room, it was reassuring that the academic quantitative work that I had done was being echoed when I went out and talked to people, which, you would certainly worry if you had one result from the quantitative literature and then you talked to a bunch of people and they all had a completely different experience, but that didn't seem to be the case.
And then on the previous question about presenting data, and what Rene said is that if you show people these forms, they may become more sympathetic. When you tell people these stories, do they change their views or do they become more sympathetic, or is it?
I think, as I said, there's a group of people who might believe in open borders or might believe that we shouldn't have a single immigrant in the U.S. And those, there's sort of a group of people that this book is not going to impact in any meaningful way. But I do think there are people who are better able to maybe put themselves in the position of someone who's going through this by reading a story, and therefore maybe has a more open mind when they're reading the data-driven evidence.
And then
That's the hope.
And Rene, for you, about changing sentiment, we talked about data, stories. Some of your research I saw, you mentioned how there's an elite audience for this work, and then they have an effect on policy. They may also affect sentiment. So can you talk a little bit about your research there, the role that elites play in affecting people's sentiment?
Absolutely. When Donald Trump first got elected, I was actually at a gym in Ann Arbor. I was at the YMCA. And this is when he announced that he was running. And he made this elevator, he made this speech when he was coming down the elevator saying, "Oh, Mexican immigrants, they're criminals, they're rapists, they're bad people." And for me, I looked at that, and as a social science nerd, I looked at that as an opportunity, right? Because that was almost what we call an exogenous shock on essentially discourse on immigration. You have, at that point, Republicans who had an agreement not to talk about immigration because they thought that had affected them in the prior election. But here comes Trump, not following those norms and having a very strong anti-immigrant discourse. So I said, this is an interesting shock to see how that may affect how people feel about immigrants. So essentially, I found, I went to Gallup, and then I found that they were running a survey during those days. So I was able to compare the people that were not exposed to Trump's speech with the folks that were interviewed after. And I found that after Trump's speech, people did report more anti-immigrant attitudes, especially Republicans, especially working class folks, especially non-Hispanic whites. So there was definitely an effect there in terms of the Trump effect. And that was one of the reasons why people were worried about this rhetoric, that it could affect how people view and feel about immigrants, right? But what I also found is that this effect doesn't last very long. It only lasts it only lasts only for a few days. part of that is because people are busy, so they're getting a lot of messages. You just forget, you move on. But the thing about the Trump administration, the Trump effect, is that it doesn't allow you to forget. It's just you're being primed constantly with these messages, with this imagery. It's almost like you're constantly being poked, being primed to think about immigrants as a threat. Immigrants are threatening some of the most precious elements in your life, which are your pets. They're like family members, right? So just imagine somebody's attacking your family directly, and for the last 80 years, we have been primed to think about immigrants as a threat. So it's not allowing people to actually go back to their baseline values of actually having a more detached view of. So I feel like there's reasons to be optimistic in the sense that if the rhetoric were to ameliorate, if it were to calm down, it would actually allow for more rational debate, more fact-based. But I wanted to follow up with you on the dysfunctional part of the immigration system, because also I guess what I was trying to, when I asked you the question about why do you think it is dysfunctional, I was also thinking about the fact that there's groups that benefit from the dysfunction of the system, right? I mean, after Trump got reelected, the next day there was a big rally in Wall Street, and some of the companies that benefited the most are the ones that are in charge of running for-profit detention centers, and they were essentially in a celebratory mood. So that's like you mentioned in your book, that's $1 billion industry, right? So there's definitely people that are in the business of housing bodies, of detaining bodies, and they see that the dysfunction as their business model to a certain degree, right? So I wonder, how do you view that?
Yeah,
right.
I think it's a good question. There's a narrow group of people who directly benefit, like the one you just mentioned.
Which they could become lobbyists, right?
They could. I don't think that's enough to explain the whole environment. It's related to your question about, similar to other systems that we see in place, like who is really benefiting from this. So as you mentioned, I had this part at the end of the book where I was trying to think about that. I don't think it benefits business in general, for example, to deport a lot of immigrants. I think that actually will harm business if it comes to pass and create, supply side shortages of the sort that maybe we saw during COVID. So I don't think the business community writ large benefits from this dysfunction, actually. But I do think they may benefit to some degree from the fear that's generated by the sort of the policies that are aggressive, and then also the poking that you just described. That sort of keeps a hierarchy going without actually removing people from the country that are contributing a lot to the economy.
So another question I want to ask is that the book came out in about 2021, and then now we're looking forward to the next administration. I just wanted to know if you could touch briefly on what happened in between there.
Yeah.
Was it business as usual during the Biden administration, or did it change, or what?
Yeah, things changed a lot. COVID happened. Immigration slowed way down during COVID. Immigration enforcement also slowed way down during that time, and then it never really picked back up in terms of interior enforcement. So there's been some, but if you compare it to the past 15 years before that, Biden really did very little interior enforcement. So that was one piece, and then the second piece that I think what everyone kept talking about, and then became the dominant storyline, was about the border. So many more people showed up at the border than had been in the past, 2022 and 2023 especially. And then also different from the past, because this had started to happen during the end of the first Trump administration. But Trump had this policy in place called Remain in Mexico, you might remember, where they were very restrictive about how they treated people once they arrived at the border and made an asylum claim. So they had people waiting on the Mexican side of the border wall because of the backlog in the asylum court system. And so that had a lot of humanitarian challenges, but it was perhaps a political benefit compared to what Biden did, which was because the border system was overwhelmed, they let people into the country to await the adjudication, which might take years in some cases. And I think that then led many people to feel like there was no control of immigration in general. And that's my current explanation for why this has moved beyond the realm of a sort of solely a white nationalist perspective to one where you see even half of Democrats saying they support mass deportation as of right before the election. So I do think that the fact that there were so many inflows over the border made people uncomfortable, and it was a broader set of issues, I think, about feeling like the government was in control of the situation.
So to follow up with that, then if you're a liberal, then you would feel more optimistic with that reading, right? Because that means that people voted for, in this case, for Trump, not because they have a deep-seated identity, some kind of major realignment, but because they just felt like right now, I feel like immigration should come down. But if you were to fix that, then I would probably change my vote in the future, right? Do you?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
You have to be able to vote in the future.
Well,
Right.
there's that.
Right.
I think there's the rhetoric that Trump has put forth, both the first time around in this election cycle, is tapping into something that I think is related to white nationalism. I think it resonates more than it would if that wasn't, sort of underlying a lot of the deep-seated feelings that many voters have. But I don't think that everyone is responding because of that in this way. I think there are other factors. And I should say, I don't think immigration was the only thing in this election. There are other things too.
So another thing that comes up in the book is kind of like federalism, or like the federal nature of enforcement versus like kind of pushing the ability to enforce these laws to local and state and local law enforcement. And so first, I want to ask you both about this, but Terry, maybe you could talk about what were those economic impacts of that type of decentralization and giving more ability to local authorities or either encouraging them or empowering them to enforce more immigration laws?
Yeah, so historically, enforcement has been in the federal realm, but starting around the mid-2000s, there started to be more of a devolution to local governments. There were explicit policies in place that allowed local law enforcement to help enforce immigration law on the ground. There was a lot of back and forth during the Obama administration about cases where it was argued that those places went too far. But then during Obama, the Secure Communities program came in, and what that does is when people are are arrested or encountering law enforcement, their information can get automatically sent to.
And that was congressional or executive order, or?
I believe it's in the executive realm totally, because it has gone back and forth about whether it has changed names, and it's more or less in place where if people are arrested, their information gets sent, and then if it appears that they might be an undocumented immigrant, the ICE can request that the local place holds someone for them, and cities and counties have varied in how they have responded to that request. But so what that means is there is quite a lot of local variation in the way that the national policy is actually implemented on the ground. And then people have used that to better understand the effects of enforcement overall. And we see, as I characterized in the talk, a lot of adverse economic impacts coming from aggressive enforcement environments, as well as human costs.
And then, so Rene, some of your research was on some of these local changes in Arizona or in Pennsylvania. So can you talk about what you studied? I know some of it had to do how did it affect people's sentiment. You could imagine that it makes people relax because now there's more enforcement, or it makes them ramp up and become even more fearful, or what did you see?
Well, I've studied the effect of these state and local policies, anti-immigrant policies, on attitudes towards immigrants and intergroup relations. And like Damon said, you could imagine a scenario where you pass a tough anti-immigrant policy and people say, okay, that was good, we took care of that, we sent a message. It could actually sort of pacify or calm things down. But what I find is the opposite. It stirs things up more, because I find that it legitimizes immigrants as a problem. It legitimizes immigrants as they're the culprit. They're the ones that are creating all these fiscal problems. They're bringing crime. So in a community, there's people who may be anxious about immigration. I mean, immigration is not easy, right? It brings a lot of change. It brings some costs, as you say, in the short term. And but then there's this rhetoric that sometimes politicians can advance, oftentimes to score political points. But that's a certain kind of ideology. Not everybody agrees with that. But when you have the weight of the law behind it, it sort of legitimizes that view. It basically says, like, yes, this makes sense. Immigrants are a problem. They are bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. And it sort of like ratifies those boundaries within communities. So I find... I've done studies looking at communities before and after these policies have been implemented, and people feel not as comfortable anymore. Like even Latino immigrants that were felt a lot more comfortable in some of these places. I can tell you a story from Hazleton, Pennsylvania, that passed a pretty punitive immigration law in 2006. I moved to town for a few months. I was doing field work. There was a bar there in the main street dedicated to the Blues Brothers. So the Blues Brothers were outside, and the owner of the bar, after Hazleton implemented the policy, set up a big sign in red letters that says, "All legals welcome. All legals welcome." That was after the policy. So one night I went there. I was an undergrad at that point. I'm making a line. I'm coming from Berkeley, California. That's where I did my undergrad. And I wanted to talk to the folks inside. I wanted to understand what they meant by that sign, because I know that sign was placed after the policy. That was a clear change. I'm making a line, and I finally it was a leathers night. So everybody, they're wearing, they're driving their Harley Davidsons, their big leather jackets, and I'm there with my California ID. Finally, I get to the bouncer, and I ask him, "Can you tell me what is that sign about?" It was literally above us, "All legals welcome." And he said, "Yeah, we put it up because there's too many illegal Puerto Ricans in town, and we're trying to keep them out." So that, for me, it was really interesting in the sense that, as we know, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens by birth, right? But that told me how the law was being interpreted at the local level. That this is not necessarily about legality, but it was about ethnicity. It was about keeping a certain ethnic group in their place, which was outside. It was not inside the bar, where they were trying to literally filter them out. So I feel like this is just an example of how these policies send messages that can actually define who belongs and who doesn't. Who are the folks that can make claims on the state, and who are the ones that should be exiting the state, right? And I find similar findings using also Twitter data from Arizona, when I find that after a big punitive law, the Show Me Your Papers law, SB 1070, I follow Twitter users over time.
Sorry, can you just explain what that is? Show Me Your Papers laws?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I'm too much of an immigration nerd. I assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. But SB 1070 was a pre-punitive law that Arizona passed And oftentimes, this was in frustration with gridlock at the federal level, as Tara mentioned, right? The fact that we don't have a comprehensive immigration reform passed. So a lot of states and localities decided to experiment with different laws. SB 1070 essentially deputized some of the local officers to implement immigration policy, and even transporting someone that didn't have documents, say you were giving somebody a ride, that could become a felony. That you could get in trouble. So folks that were in churches or volunteer services, they could have become targets. So that policy became, and typically when you have a policy like this, it's not passed in a vacuum. All of a sudden you have this huge rhetoric about immigration where people say they're bringing all this crime. It is really like a community has become consumed by this very heated debate, where people are shouting and they're red in their faces. So what I find is that after you pass this law, even though it was actually quite, challenged in court, but what I find is that Twitter users from Arizona started to talk about immigrants and about Latinos in much negative ways. So, and their tweets about African Americans or about Asian Americans were not affected. It was only about immigrants and Latinos. And I think that also shows how in the U.S. we have certain ideas about who immigrants are. There are certain people that come to your mind. It's typically not folks that come from. I mean, I always ask this question in public forums: how many undocumented immigrants from Europe or Canada live in the U.S.? I always ask this question, and people are like, I've never really thought about that. But there's about 500,000. There's 500,000, but they're completely invisible. We don't really think about them because we have a certain idea, a certain look, a certain sound, certain name of who is an undocumented immigrant. And those ideas drive a lot of the public policy debate, as you document in your book.
So, so another question I have for me, who's less of an expert, and either you can comment on this. How does this compare to other countries or comparable countries? The mix of border versus interior enforcement, are we outliers? Are we harsher? Are we less harsh? Or how do you, I know Rene did some research in Europe. So, any thoughts about that? Other countries in similar positions?
So I would say there aren't a lot of countries that feel like they've really gotten to the place, like the end place with this question. I've been at Brookings for a couple of years, and people come by pretty regularly at Brookings and ask for meetings, and there have been a lot of people, European delegations, coming by and asking me about what they should be doing with their immigration system, as if the U.S. has it solved somehow. So I think a lot of countries are struggling with the same set of issues. The one person I've talked to who thinks their country is doing pretty well was from Australia, and they have a sort of natural advantage in the fact that their border is much easier to manage. And so, they felt they were doing a reasonably good job of dealing with the various competing interests. But maybe you want to add on the Europe.
Right. I mean, I've worked on the case of Spain, and I feel like in relative terms, European countries, they spend more resources on integration.
Yes.
On really trying to facilitate the adaptation of immigrants, and we spend more resources on exclusion and enforcement, as Sarah's book mentions. For example, in the case of Spain, when a new immigrant, first of all, the undocumented population in Spain tends to be pretty small, because when it starts growing, then they go through a legalization process, right? That's like massive. So you don't really have this large undocumented population there. And they do a lot at the local level to help integrate folks. In some places in Catalonia, like the area near Barcelona where I've done field work, you're an immigrant. Your first destination when you move to a town is you go to the Office of Immigration Reception. You go in there and you say, I have moved to this town. And they say, great, we're going to, they check you in. They say, do you have kids? Are they going to school? They assign social workers to your kids. They follow up, and then they check to make sure that they're going to school. They have classes on their languages, even on how to recycle trash or how to cook. And they also have an army of what they call cultural mediators. So going back to your point, Damon, about policing, but the argument is that oftentimes when there is conflict between immigrants and natives, it could be a very basic thing such as, I feel like your food's a little spicy, or I feel like you're inviting too many people, or your music's too loud, and just basic little things like that that can escalate, especially when you call the police, right? So instead of that, what they have is these cultural mediators that they come in and they try to mediate things and say, okay, let's hear each other out, let's try to find a common ground. Not a perfect system, there's definitely conflict as well, there's anxieties, but they do have a different focus that is more about trying to adapt, more about trying to integrate.
I think that's definitely true, but we also have the case study of Brexit, and I think there's, these are issues that are difficult for a lot of countries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the economy there may be such that you don't want to turn people away if you need to like reinforce your labor force and things like that.
Well, this is something I've been saying and hasn't really caught on yet, but in 10, 20 years, all of the wealthy countries that have these declining fertility rates are going to be scrambling to try to get people. And so we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot by not starting that process now.
At the same time, we do have a slightly different context in that the flows coming to the U.S. are larger often, than they come to Europe. You have some, big news in Europe saying, oh, there's a boat with 100 people, 200 people, and it makes it to the front page. We deal with much larger flows of immigration, so that's also a key difference.
So let me do this last question, and then we're gonna open up to the audience. And sorry that I've had my back to this side of the audience the whole time. I was trying to be sure to pivot back and forth. So I'll pivot as I ask this last question. There are some interesting, coalitions that come up in the book. There are business interests. There are people who look at this from a social justice angle. There are people who are trying to come to the United States, people who are undocumented and vulnerable. And so trying to end on a hopeful note, what have you seen where there's been opportunity to make some changes for improvements for the better, and what constituencies are there that, should be maybe seeing common ground and trying to push for that?
Yeah, I think the best hope is around the issue of legal migration, especially legal migration of people with high levels of education. That's a group that is often not demonized in the same way in the public debate. It is a group that generates a lot of value for American businesses. And I've been a little surprised and disappointed that the business community hasn't been more vocal in trying to get some of our caps expanded for this group. But I think part of what has happened to date is that both the right and the left kind of view this as like they want to take this group as a hostage and try to get the other parts of the package that they're interested in. And so no one's willing to just peel off that piece of reform so far. But that may change with this new administration or going forward, because I don't think holding out for comprehensive reform would be necessarily something people will see a lot of likelihood of happening in the next couple of years. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
So let's open it up to the audience, and we have microphones. So keep your hands raised, and then the microphone we'll bring the microphone up to you.
So you show up at this bar, and I'm thinking that the bouncer cannot distinguish your accent as not Puerto Rican. How does he react to you? And is there this, that he sees you as he's able to recognize you as, oh, he's a pretty good guy, even if he may be Puerto Rican. So is that so many immigrants are underground and we don't meet them necessarily or recognize them in our everyday lives that's impairing our ability to move forward on this issue?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so I showed him my ID from California, and he was like, "Whoa!"
So he's more concerned about that. Like,
So
that's really foreign.
He's like, "I never seen one of this," right? But I also feel like oftentimes, in the cities among academic circles, we have a certain type of etiquette and politeness, But I feel like in other places, people are more straight up, right? They tell you how they feel. And that was definitely my experience in some of these communities, that they're really, they don't have, they remove a lot of the filters that we take for granted.
Even though they recognize you as being foreign, they don't have any.
Yeah.
They aren't polite.
And the striking thing for me is like, okay, this is a person that's in charge of applying the law at this point. I mean, he's a bouncer. He's like literally letting people in and out. And this letting people in and out, for me, it symbolized the letting in people in and out into our communities, right? Who do we allow in? Who are we suspicious of?
Just on your broader question, I think the evidence suggests that people who are more in day-to-day contact with immigrants tend to be more pro-immigration. It's hard to know which, chicken and egg there. But the one group that tends to be more hostile towards immigration are groups that have very low levels of immigrants in their local communities, but have seen large increases in percentage terms. And so that fear of change coupled with a lack of exposure, I think, is potentially where you see some problems.
Other questions? Okay.
Right back here. I think it's interesting that there's such an emphasis on Haitian communities allegedly eating pets in Springfield, Ohio recently, when the prevailing sentiment for decades is that immigrants seek to harm actual human beings. And we're seeing this relatively slow and regressive creep toward a magnified state. So my question is, how quickly can policies like ending birthright citizenship and mass deportations, for example, be enacted and enforced? And where do you foresee safe havens for undocumented migrants and or their U.S.-born children?
So on the deportation, I think it's not something where you just snap your fingers. It will take a while, but I think what you'll see is a movement towards a more aggressive regime right away, and then how far that goes, I think, remains to be seen. It will depend on how much money is allocated to it, how much political pushback there is. On the safe havens, I think there already is in many communities a large network of people who are playing that role, and I expect that they'll just have a lot to do. So schools have been really instrumental in helping the community stay together when there are large enforcement events and so on.
So I think sorry.
And I just wanted to say that typically what you see is a pendulum. Like if you see immigration attitudes over time, there's ups and downs, right? For example, during the first Trump administration, they had these very harsh policies about separating families on the border, right? About about Cajun kids, And first, I think people were supportive of that, but then the pictures start to come out. You had these pictures of children in cages. You had these pictures of young mothers surrounded by these border patrol agents, and a little toddler just crying, looking at her mom being manhandled by these very buff guys. When those pictures started to get around, I remember some of the Christian communities, they said, wait a second, what are we doing here? Even conservative groups. And I feel like that's when all of a sudden you see a shift in public opinion, where all of a sudden, towards the end of the Trump administration, you saw some of the highest levels of support for immigration, some of the highest levels in decades. Now we're on the other side. Now we have some of the highest levels of people supporting restrictions on immigration. I think part of that is because of these flows that you showed in the graph. But I feel like if the situation gets really harsh and you start seeing these images, people may actually start changing their minds about the harshness of these policies.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there could be a situation where it becomes visible to everyone because literally people are being dragged away on the street. I mean, that's a sort of extreme case, but it could happen. And I do think at some point the public starts to say, wait a second, this isn't what we meant. Because even though the majority of voters now say they support mass deportation, also a majority say they support a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. So I think it's sort of, we're a country of contradictions.
I think we have time for one more quick one.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you for being here. I guess my question that I have is about immigration policy specifically. I've learned a lot about immigration policy and especially worker visas and guest worker visas, and I agree with you that this is probably the avenue where we could probably get bipartisan support. But at the same time, I've looking at the demographics recently of historically of the kind of immigrants that have been coming up until 2012. Migration had been historically young males looking for work, and for me that's why this sort of program would work. Looking at I recently looked at new statistics that show that demographic has been changing, and now people actually coming at the border are more family units who are seeking permanent residence within, and so that kind of makes this option of immigration reform on this avenue of guest worker visas not as feasible as it used to be. And so I guess do you still believe that is the way to go, or how would we adjust an approach for immigration policy reform given that the demographic is changing from young male workers to family units?
Yeah, so I guess the employment pathways include some temporary employment-based visas that traditionally are for just single people to come, like agricultural workers or temporary seasonal workers. But where I think there might be more scope is actually in pathways that are already, like the H-1B program, for example, that's already bringing people and their dependents with an intention, usually or often, to stay long-term. So I don't view it as that much of a shift, even though there's been some sort of change in the demographics of who's coming to the border.
Great. So unfortunately, we do have more people who have questions. So, but we're gonna transition the programming. So first, let's give it up for our guests and our speakers. And then thanks again for coming to another Stone Center event. Be on the lookout, join our mailing list. And I'd like to thank the team, the staff, and everyone who's made this event possible. So let's give it up for them. And two announcements. One is that there is a reception. It will be on the first floor. So there will be some bites and some drinks. And then we can continue the discussion down there. And also, we don't have the physical books to sell here, unfortunately. But I think out there at the table, there are QR codes. So you can use that it'll open up a link where you can purchase the book as well, which I highly recommend. So I would take a look at that too on your way downstairs to the reception. So thanks again, and everyone have a good night.